biology is all about, you know, that's what Cannon and
Sydney, I'm trying
Bernard referred to it. Walter B. Cannon coined the term homeostasis. I do understand the difficulty. It doesn't, homeostasis sounds like it's static, which is not what this is all about. I guess I wanted to remain tethered to some reality. Sorry?
Hold on.
It's all right. Hang on. Just.
Okay. So autopoiesis would be a better terminology. I'll take that under advisement. Thank you.
Lou wanted you to expand on the anthropic principle.
Oh, yes. So I was wondering what your stance is in relation to the anthropic principle. You mentioned it briefly earlier in the talk.
Yeah, I have a huge problem with that because anthropic principle says we are in this cosmos, not of it. It's like Sagan used to say at the close of his, television show, we are all star stuff. We literally are star stuff. So I think that the problem for me is that being plopped into this, isn't it great that water freezes from the, in a pond from the top to the bottom so the fish don't all die, blah, 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 blah. That's a narrative that I think is derivative of biblical writings or something like that. I mean, it just doesn't do it for me. It fails to acknowledge the integration of the physiology, the biology, and the physics. That's
so one might revise the question and ask, still ask, what are the relationships between the, in fact, you're asking them, what is the relationship between the biological structure and the structure of awareness and the laws of physics? You can ask the question in that large way and not have to be involved in an anthropic principle.
Yeah, but it's kind of convention. That's the way people are thinking. I mean, they're also thinking mechanically instead of mechanistically, and there are all kinds of. I think that there are a lot of disambiguations because we're looking at the whole process from the wrong perspective, and so I'm trying to rectify that in the way that I've deconvoluted this whole thing. But I hear what you're saying. I understand. Sure.
Another question, and then I'll stop asking questions. One of the differences that's very striking between the quantum mechanics level and the biological level is that at the quantum mechanical level, there's the no cloning theorem, which prohibits the reproduction or splitting of quantum states. And yet, by the time we get to the molecular level of the DNA, indeed we have cloning.
Right, so I was trying to explain that I think that that nucleotides, so what you see repeatedly in biology is first you have a circumstance, an existential circumstance that has to be addressed by the traits that the organism has. And then over time that adaptive strategy becomes hardwired, if you will, genetically. So the genes evolve in order to provide the stability to the system. So what I'm saying is that I hadn't come across non-cloning, but I think that for me, the critical juncture was this idea that lipids, it's all about lipids. And so I guess in that context, there is no clonality there because once you violate the micelle, there's nothing there. It's a nothing burger. I don't know if that's what that infers, but I guess that would be my response.
No, what I'm saying is that when you compare the quantum theory and the biological theory, there are all these parallels. There are also differences, and it's worthwhile to look at how the differences work as well as how the parallels work. One of those key differences is that when you're dealing with pure quantum states, you can't let them reproduce. They don't.
Okay. Whereas I'm saying that it's all about reproduction in a sense. I guess that's okay. So I guess okay. Got it. But a question that has arisen in my mind, Lou, is if I'm right about the explicate having arisen from the biologic property.
That's another question, of course. You speak of the explicate, but
Yeah.
perhaps you're speaking of what we as observers consider to be an explicate order, because it seems to me that whenever we speak of an explicate, we are talking about how that is for some observer of that explicate.
Yeah.
And without the observer, there is no explicate. But then different observers have arisen biologically. So if you take the biological stance, then you have a fuller context for what it means to have an explicate. But nevertheless, every observer has his own explicate, and yet there may be something that you could say more objectively, but I doubt it.
Yeah, what I was trying to say was, as I listened to your presentation, Peter's presentation, the mathematics, it just, and I've talked to Mark about this. I don't know, I'm asking the question, is it reasonable to suggest that the biologic principles constrain the mathematics? So in other words, there's a whole myriad of possibilities mathematically. However, to make it relevant to us, there have to be constraints. So in that context of what you just said about the non-clonality, for example, is that true for quantum mechanics, but not true for biology? Clearly it's not true. And maybe it's not true, period. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, there's more than one question here. What constrains a given physical level or a given scientific level? And what constrains mathematics? Well, I think if you ask what constrains mathematics, you have to ask what is mathematics, and then you have a long and complex debate about whether that means something spiritual or it means something linguistic and so on. So I'd better not try to talk about it.
Astrology.
Well, that's actually where I was coming from, is because if you accept my idea about language being derivative of our physiology, the question to my mind is mathematics a meta language? In other words, it's constrained by our physiology. It only has relevance within the context of our physiology.
Well, the point is that mathematics is something that evolved for human beings, that was a kind of language that they can be shared across languages. In that sense, it is meta language, but on the other hand, it's not exactly speaking about so much as we can share it. All cultures have numbers, and to a good extent, all cultures can share with one another what numbers are and how they work, and other aspects of mathematics and symbolism and so on. So mathematics becomes universal in that rough sense of being able to be shared across many different differences.
So do you think that mathematics exists in the implicate order, or is it only the explicate order?
Well, I don't even know what implicate order means, but I take the stance of neutral monism, which would not necessarily, I'm sorry, it's probably not the right stance, but I take the stance that whereof I cannot speak, I must remain silent. As far as the implicate order is concerned, I don't know any structure for the implicate order, but I would be willing to speak of an implicate order out of which the apparent differences and distinctions in this world appear. And so mind appears, and matter appears, and many other things appear, and those are all aspects of the implicate. Aspects, ways of looking at. But as far as saying what the implicate order itself is, I'm not allowed to talk.
David Bohm associated it with the non-dualistic, so it's almost escapes characterization by concepts that are separated from each other. It's sort of
Well, let me ask the question this way. I mean, if I'm right about consciousness, our consciousness and the consciousness of the cosmos being one and the same, once you achieve that convergence of both of consciousness, is mathematics still relevant? I don't think it is any longer.
This is
Or
where
is mathematics still around? Well, but the thing is, what is mathematics? Mathematics is noticing parallels between just separate things. The number 2 is applicable to any couple that you should come across. It is coming to those kind of patterns, and it occurs in minds. If there is no minding, then there's no mathematics. I don't think of mathematics as being platonically existing outside of mind, but consciousness and mind keep co-creating one another, perhaps, and so at some level of awareness without language, you would not have mathematics, yes, but then I can't imagine how you could have, well, what do you want to have? I mean, you can go to a state where there isn't any language, or you can create language. It's your choice, or it's the universe's choice.
Or it's an artifact. I think that's what I'm getting
I'm
at.
sorry.
Or it's an artifact. It's an artifact.
What do you mean by an artifact?
An artifact of our physiology attempting to approximate the consciousness of the cosmos. And once it's achieved, so I've been in a...
well, hold on a minute. I mean, you talk about the consciousness of the cosmos, and you would suggest that for your experience of whatever that might be, there wouldn't be language? Is that what you're saying?
It's not necessary anymore. It's just a means to an end. It's not as it's no longer necessary once you are connected to the cosmologic consciousness.
May I ask on that point, John, how did you arrive at the idea of equating human consciousness with cosmic consciousness? Just because, in fact, I won't say anything else until you've answered.
Well, because I was perplexed by Chalmers' hard problem. It didn't make sense to me in that there had to be an explanation for that. And then when I started to think about my way of thinking about the vertical integration of physiology, so for example, the way I look at this process, it explains why it is that we go back to the unicellular state over the course of the life cycle. We never left it. We're just like the Red Queen and Alice. We're running as fast as we can to remain in juxtaposition to the singularity. And so in that sense, I could now rationalize Chalmers' question, because what we're doing is we are referencing that our origins cellularly all the time, and we don't have to do it all the time, but it is within our capacity to do that. One of the reasons that I started to think about this is because I had come up with this hypothesis, which I published, a central theory of biology. There is none. So I came up with this idea that the reason that warm-bloodedness evolved was through physiologic stress, and I gave that explanation earlier in my talk. And that in fact, and it's necessary to be warm-blooded to be bipedal. Only birds and humans are bipedal naturally. Other organisms can sort of do it after a fashion, but it's not their natural bent. And we share commonalities in terms of our brain function, birds and humans. The brain has to cool during REM sleep, for example. That's been shown, et cetera, et cetera. But my point being that I started to play devil's advocate and say, well, maybe this is crazy stuff. But then I realized that if hibernation or meditation is the obverse of a Maslow peak moment, physiologically, it's literally the opposite process. If you go through the stepwise process. So that's why I had the audacity to publish that, to try to publish that.
It's very promising that you arrived at that through speculation, conjecture, rationalization, because this is something that people arrive at phenomenologically through these peak experiences that you were speaking of. One of the core realization.
Oops.
We really are jinxed today, aren't we? Laurie, are you there?
Maybe he's deep in thought.
Yeah.
But you were speaking of cosmic consciousness going beyond language. And many people have talked about it that way, consciousness without an object.
Yeah.
If in this world we think of the states that we're in, and they're like pendulum swinging, and the extreme of an articulated state is like the swing of a pendulum up to a point where there's no thought. There's no thought. And it's balanced there, but it's balanced there momentarily, and then it comes back. And we go back and forth between that undifferentiated state and the differentiated state. And at least in my point of view, the undifferentiated is necessary, like the implicate is necessary, but it isn't that the differentiated is somehow just an artifact. It is part of the whole of the pendulum swinging.
Yeah, I understand. I think I understand the TikTok thing, and I tried to rationalize that in the context of my way of thinking. I am guessing that the TikTok comes from that pulsatility, from like pulsars impinging on those ANPA files, causing. So what that would do, in a physical chemical sense, is it would cause the uptake of calcium ions from the surrounding waters by these micelles, and then water would be schlepped in as a consequence, because you have to have that balance of the water and the ions, and that actually is the origin of that TikTok pulsatility. We know that there's pulsatility that's pervasive in physiology, and I think that that's the origin of that. So I think that what I would say to you is, yeah, we need that, both that grounding in our own experiential arc, but we always are reaching for the ultimate consciousness, and we exist in that limbo between that's what I said earlier about.
I guess it's a difference it's just a question of point of view. Sometimes in working, one thinks of reaching for an ultimate consciousness as a goal, and sometimes one would let go of that as a goal and understand that it's part of the process.
Sure. I think that, so my reduction of religion is, so we came from caves. It's my turn to go out and catch dinner tonight. I go out and I face the saber-toothed tiger. If I blink, I'm the tiger's dinner. Otherwise, he's my dinner. And if you cycle that over and over again, that's what I think we're talking about. It's that difference between we have to have the explicate because we have to survive, but that there is this inobturate process of human evolution, which is taking us further and further away from the explicate, closer and closer to the implicate, but we will never reach it because we originate in ambiguity, and we are here to cope with that uncertainty, and therefore it's an asymptote.
But remember that the stand of creativity and playfulness allows that making explicate in some way that is satisfying as an activity can be regarded as not as going beyond pure survival, right?
Sure.
That it isn't simply an activity that gives pleasure, and the activity of giving pleasure in that case tends towards unity.
I agree with that. I mean, I spent 50 years creating experimental data that ultimately brought me to this way of thinking. So I understand what you're saying. We have to problem solve. We are always empiricists. And sometimes it's pragmatic, and sometimes it's fun, and sometimes it's both. I agree with that. But I think that that's part and parcel of what I'm talking about. That's the ultimate drive that we have, to problem solve, and that our reach should exceed our grasp. No?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lou, can I ask, you invoked Warren McCulloch's question, what is a number that a man might know it, and what is a man that he might know a number, the other day. I think we were talking about mechanism. And it sent me to look back at McCulloch's paper, which, of course, in the first paragraph, he introduces this whole problem of physiology, that actually you can't address the question unless we have physiology and biology, and we have this
So
integration.
that was certainly his point of view, and that's where the whole idea of the neural nets of McCulloch and Fitts comes from, right? That they wanted to have they wanted to create the brain on the basis of something near physiology and something near cybernetic turn as well.
I mean, what is he right, do you think? Or is that a particular stance?
Well, it's a way of investigating. You're thrown into a world in which you have physiology, and it's quite clear in the world in which you're thrown that the physiology is highly related to everything else.
This is
So you should be investigating everything and how it's related.
This is like McEwen's the medium is the message, that the fact that we are incorporated, corporealized into this kind of physiology informs the questioning process that we have of reality, that the dialectic is necessarily molded by the fact that we're primates living on an Earth-like planet. Whereas if we were Boltzmann brains, perhaps we'd be asking a different set of questions.
Some problems really require an answer within the system in which they've been given. Like if I ask whether there are infinitely many twin primes, you're going to have to address it as a number theory problem no matter what you do. But the question of the origin of consciousness could be taken seriously as, does it come from the physiology? Does it come from the underlying physical basis? Or is consciousness already present in universe, as John would say? But John is looking at both sides of that question. And where you go with that question is actually, it seems to me, quite open. You don't have to insist on figuring out how consciousness comes out of the brain. For example, if you're looking at the brain as a material entity, you don't have to. Who said you had to? But maybe you're very interested in physiology and you want to know it that way.
Well, with the experiments that I have done in my laboratory and the experiments done on yeast at Boston University, the fact that if you virtually eliminate gravity, the cell becomes a zombie. So it tells me that we are intimately related to the cosmos. Our being is contingent upon the physical forces of the cosmos. So
sure.
that's why I think it's necessary that we consider what consciousness
is. Absolutely. It is necessary, but a person, it's like any other aspect of science. Let me give you a nuts and bolts example. The guys who want to design quantum algorithms are, up to a certain point, able to just look at some list of properties of quantum theory and not think about the physics at all and design that. And then, of course, you have to think about the physics sooner or later. And people who are thinking about linguistics may think about the curious ways in which people form and shape words and exchange them, and not think about how language is coming in relation to physiology. But sooner or later, it has to be integrated. It's always possible to draw some line and investigate inside that line. But it will only go so far. It'll only go so far. You take pure mathematical problem and you go ahead and investigate it, like say the Riemann hypothesis, and people are finding that, oh, it begins to look like quantum theory, but it's just a pure number theory problem. What's going on there? You push the boundaries, having decided that you're going to draw a line and work on it just inside that line, and you find out that they don't work anymore. There's something outside the boundary that you need. But how do you get to you can't encompass a whole right at the beginning when you're trying to work. You You have to say, okay, I'm going to work on this piece of paper. I'm going to write this. Or I'm going to do that experiment.
Oh, I agree. As I said, I've spent 50 years at the bench.
Yeah,
I finally was able to liberate myself to think about what I was doing, because
exactly.
I thought I was going to come up with some physiologic premise that would extricate me from chasing my tail. It gets tiring. I mean, it puts food on the table, but it's bullshit. Okay, that's why I started thinking about these things. And so interestingly, so František Beluška is a botanist in Berlin, and František has said basically the converse of what I've said about consciousness. He's saying that plants, their brains, they orient downward instead of upward. Their roots are where their consciousness is. So there are a lot of interesting, contrasts and comparisons which are totally consistent between plants and animals with regard to consciousness.
I was going to propose an experiment actually that might be able to differentiate between consciousness as a purely emergent from the bottom up phenomenon, or as you're suggesting, meeting from both ends, demerging from the cosmos. And that would be whether artificial intelligences are alien qualitatively to our own because they're not embodied in a biological system. So to what extent does my consciousness depend on having bile, on having organs, on how they're integrating information? Or if a lot of it is informed from the top down, then would the artificial intelligence have a similar perspective from the cosmos?
Well, there was that, so Jeopardy is a popular quiz program in this country. I don't know if it gets over the pond, but the IBM AI machine challenged the best of the best humans, and it killed them in terms of the competition. But there were two questions that the machine could not answer because they were inferential. So I would maintain, in response to your comment, I think an AI machine can tell a joke. It cannot make a joke up. It doesn't understand that kind of calculus of the brain that we have. There is a demarcation between human intelligence and AI intelligence. And certainly at a fundament, I think the difference is that the AI is contingent upon some software engineer. Our intelligence comes from an independent source, I think.
I think there's an Asimov short story about this, jokes and robots, or jokes in a big computer.
Oh, okay. Maybe you can post the link. I haven't read that.
Peter.
But I think it's important because the brain is just like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. And if we become dependent upon AI, we will become their slaves. And Asimov warned us of that. And I think it's true, because we will become mentally lazy, which is the only, our intelligence is the only thing that advantage we have over all other species. It's also our downfall, if you will, because and I don't want to go into that necessarily, but it is our downfall. The fact that we know that we're mortal is what's driving us to neuroses to do what we do. And I think we need to understand that.
Can I ask Peter Rowlands on this question, particularly about AI? Because I know you make a distinction about natural information and artificial, or the information of computers and the information of nature, which I think is very important here.
Oh yeah, I think that that it does matter that we are human and that we have developed and evolved in an environment to interact with that environment, because that's why our brain is different from any computer that we construct. And I think that's definitely the case. And I think Peter Marsa might also have something to say on that as well. Peter?
Well, I mean, I've got something to say on that.
Yes.
And then Peter can come in. I mean,
All right, go on then.
Okay, I think one thing that's very clear is that AI depends on computers, which are binary, and obviously there's a whole question what will happen with quantum computers, but so how we develop them. But thinking is not binary, and when that difference between consciousness and awareness is that ability, which is, well, I mean, obviously I have the spiritual perspective, which is to do with cosmic as intelligence. We are in an intelligent universe, which I choose to call God. People can call different things, but so we are, and so we can tap into that. But we have created these binary intelligences, which as you were saying as well, is as you were saying, John, it's kind of, those are certain human artifacts. But I think there's so Asimov is very interesting, but also Philip K. Dick, I think that whatever it was, do electric sheep
androids do androids dream of electric sheep?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which was,
I mean, Nicola, you say that we're not binary, but either a neuron is firing or it isn't.
Yeah,
according to some observer. There's a criterion.
Well,
the thing about the computers being binary is that we've made them into a set of, they depend on a very specifically chosen mechanism of quanta, 0, 1, high voltage, low voltage, and organizations of those. The computers do not create distinctions at their base. And we are open to distinctions occurring at our base. So we're organized in the opposite way. And computers do not automatically or normally create, and we do. So it's quite different. And we're on the other side of them, and we're using them.
I don't know whether computers create or not. I don't really understand what that means. But if you look at some of the chess games played by, just trying to remember its name now, Alpha
yeah, I agree with you. At that level, they do.
Yeah.
I really suggest that the computer is recapitulating that endosymbiosis, because every time it plays a game against a human, it's importing that information, and this is how they're trained. They usually train against historic games or playing adversarially against another version of itself. So it is actually informing information from the interaction with the game. So that's similar in my mind to this endosymbiosis. But actually, to get binary computers to make them deterministic, most of the engineering work goes into quashing the life out of the quantum processes to make sure that gate stays up long enough to inform the next gate. You're actually taking a complex system and trying to get enough redundancy in it so that it's simply a 0 or a 1 and not in between. And then quantum computers.
But biologically, we are binary in the sense that we are a fight or flight organism, but there's a distinction between fight or flight and problem solving. Both processes are dependent upon adrenaline. You do need some anxiety to learn. That's well known, but too much and you get flooded and you blank out and it's either fight or flight. So I do think that, and I think that AI will drive us further and further towards fight or flight, because we will not have that connection I talked about linguistically with a civilization and culture being the closing of the loop of our processes of understanding our being.
I think.
But we're not just fight or flight. There's this whole, oh my goodness, what's it called? The third, is it cranial nerve 10? That joins up, it's extraordinary, and it's got two different kinds of, it works through the different, the autonomic nervous system and something. My God.
You're talking about Poirier's
Oh, that's right, exactly. Yeah, that's the one.
Absolutely.
And that is not fight or flight. That is actually, it is empathetic and empathic.
Absolutely.
So and that is key to human.
Yeah.
But on this point, I really liked what you said, John, about the the release of the endorphins and the OxyContin facilitating.
No, not OxyContin. That's pharmacology.
Oxytocin. Yeah, oxytocin facilitating coherence of the calcium channels. Is that what you suggested? Just because, without getting myself into too much trouble, some of these peak experience phenomenologically involves transcending an angst in the sort of Schopenhauer sense when the consciousness is expanded. And the methodology for that is to generate a lot of loving kindness energy, and that you can experience this for yourself. That integrates the consciousness, and that opens the gateway to these peak experiences. And so it's fascinating to me that there's an actual physiological mechanism for this through the calcium, if that's what it was.
Yeah, I think the literature suggests that you know, that coherence and wave collapse, I mean, we call it love, but in reality, I think it's our recognition of our oneness. And I'm not a spiritualist, I'm a physiologist, but I think that the data take you there to understand that there is a convergence of our physiology and that of the cosmos, or at least it is an option. It's something we do strive for, and we are able to attain if we only were to allow it to happen. I mean, I think that's, you know, there's all this stuff on psilocybin, you know, allowing people to kick their alcoholism, for example. I mean, it's rewiring the brain. So it's clear that there are tripwires, there are triggers, there are ways that we can either adapt or be maladaptive. And that the adaptive strategy ultimately will bring us to recognizing how we are at one with the cosmos, ultimately. Yeah.
So, John, is the peak experience a kind of total assent? Is it a kind of giant yes, that we just say yes to everything, that we open to everything? Is that what love is? Is that what these ultimate sort of ecstatic moments?
Yeah, I think it's that the convergence of our personal consciousness with the consciousness of the cosmos then opens you up to possibilities that would never, so you're moving away from the explicit and towards the implicate. You are opening up to opportunities that are unattainable in the day-to-day mechanisms of physiology that essentially are what keep us from being eaten by the big bear, you know, that sort of thing.
And
Yeah.
is that the endosymbiotic mechanism as well? Is that the cell opening up to its environment, absorbing it?
Yes. Yeah, so that the connection between us and Gaia is a real thing. So Nick Christakis is an epidemiologist. He talks about his contagion theory. So he's a physician, so he's trying to understand why his computer modeling actually shows how human communities are networked totally. He's demonstrated that empirically. And I think that he's actually tapped into that phenomenon that you just related, the integration of the organism and its environment in a literal continuum. Yeah.
I'm reminded of another thing I found really fascinating, which is that you say the epigenetically, the past phylogenetic traumas are continually occurring again. So this pulsar creating the pulsification is somehow being experienced, and other, you use the example of the stress of the migration out of the water is somehow still being experienced moment to moment. And this is informing the more complex dynamics at higher levels. Because when you're talking about psilocybin alcoholism, there's one theory of trauma is that when trauma, either physical or emotional, happens, it continues to happen on an unconscious level. So if you have an injury somewhere, that there's a memory in the organ or the tissue of that trauma, and you're suggesting this on an even longer, like, evolutionary scale. But you're also saying that it can be useful, and not just that it allows a higher degree of this homeoresis.
Yeah, I put out a question a while back to people that I communicate with. I think, Mark, you were included, saying, you know, do butterflies have caterpillar dreams?
Oh, yeah.
And I got a response from a friend of mine saying, yes, there is experimental evidence that if you take caterpillars, they are attracted by a certain pheromone in their, or chemical in their environment that they like. And if you chemically expose them when they're caterpillars to that chemical scent, and you shock them, when they become butterflies and you expose the butterfly to the scent, they freak out. So the butterfly remembers its caterpillar state. Yes, there is a continuum there, correct. Yes.
It's like some very young children can remember being in the womb also.
Well, Salvatore Dali claimed that he could remember being in the womb, for example. Yes.
Yeah. No, there's quite a lot of, there's a guy called Ray Castellino in California, and he's a craniosacral and he's been working with a whole load of people, working with mothers and babies and children. And if you know, so that, I mean, there are cases where there was a beautiful one where the mum actually sort of said at some point to the child, I can't remember. Do you remember when you were inside me? And he goes, yeah, of course I do. You know, she'd never asked before. Yeah, I can remember because, you know, whatever the sister was, it was horrible because she was kicking me, you know, and she said, and this was how it was. There's a certain stage in the pregnancy when the girl was in bed as well, and that was what was happening. The girl was like thrashing around and kicking, and I mean, there are things like that. But also, because the other thing I was interested in was the near-death experience thing, because there are, you know, there are people who have been, you know, clinically dead, brain dead, but have been experiencing things and then have come back, and it's been verified what's been happening. So this would be a question of consciousness or awareness going beyond our physiology.
And during general anaesthetic, people have remembered conversations that surgeons have had while they've been under anaesthetic. So that's the anaesthesia, the detachment of a consciousness from its link to the physiology.
Yeah.
Well, and there's an anesthesiologist who's published a couple of papers on demonstrating that as his patients came out from under general anesthesia, they basically recapitulate the evolution of the brain, the stepwise re-engagement of, you know, the brainstem and then the cerebellum and then so he's documented that. So there is evidence for that. Right. Yes. Yeah.
There's a esotericist, or there was, called Eugene Halliday, and he made this point in reference to a sort of Buddhist concept called the long body, and that's if you forget about time, we are all part of one what's the word, endoplasm, or that there's been successive divisions from the same substance. So we are in a sense part of this long body of the entire evolutionary process, and that there is a continuity if you allow going backwards in time, then because we have split off from our parents, who have split off from their parents, and then to level of cell mitosis, that we are all part of the same, is it endoplasm? What's the word I'm trying to think of here? But the same kind of substance. It's kind of a web of life is continuous in some sense.
You know, Krishnamurti talked when in his dialogue with Bono, 25 years, in a 1983 discussion, he's saying that the problem humans have is that the ego gets in the way of their connection with the cosmos. So he's talking about that, an instantaneous realization of our consciousness and cosmic consciousness. I think that is incorrect. I think that the way we achieve that is through the kind of thing I'm talking about, that our physiology can be in sync with the cosmos because we're derived from it. And so it's through those physiologic mechanisms that it's not a switch, it's a rheostat. And that furthermore, because the physiology is so dependent upon these receptor-mediated mechanisms, we know that receptors can be trained and retrained to be more physiologically sensitive. So that's what meditation is about. I've talked to many people, friends and others, about meditation, and they all agree that as you do that process, you become more and more capable of jumping into that mind state. And I don't think that's habituation, or better said, habituation is what I'm talking about. So there is a real physiological process that enables us to make these connections in a functionally relevant way.
Well, how would that be different from what Krishnamurti was saying?
Because he didn't have a process to get you from the mundane to the sublime. I'm saying that there is a way that you can learn.
But he had an injunction. He would ask people to understand that they are that, and he had a philosophical dialogue. So he was working in that form of a yoga. There are many ways to work. Sure,
I understand that, but I guess I took exception in the sense that, I mean, it was odd that he was telling Bohm this, but Bohm in Wholeness and the Implicate Order talks about that experiment he does with the two Indian ink dots and the stretching of the matrix. He's talking about an empiric way of understanding what Krishnamurti is talking about. So not all of us are believers, but we can become believers through the process.
Bohm, of course, is superimposed with the problem of understanding quantum mechanics. So his search for enlightenment is a search for becoming enlightened and becoming enlightened about quantum mechanics.
Right. No, I understand, but in the process, he kind of stumbled onto what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But for me, Lou, I think the thing is that I'm an atheist. I'm the product of Holocaust survivors, so I don't believe, okay? But I do believe in what I'm talking about because it is a way to understand how I can emulate the kinds of things that believers do. They're basically fast tracking what I'm talking about. It opens up to teaching people how to do this rather than it being a binary, right? Which I think is important. The opportunity to open up to new ways of thinking through training our physiology to be more open to experience.
Can I ask a question about that? At one point you talked about bipedalism making it possible for us to experience past, present, and future, and I didn't get that link. Why that would be? I mean, it means we've got, we have a back and a front, but in the middle, maybe it's that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there was huge selection pressure. Once we were standing on two legs and we had the freedom of our forelimbs, it opened up to all kinds of possibilities that then fed back into the evolution of the higher processes in the brain, which then caused the condition in which, as opposed to other organisms, I think we are unique amongst all organisms because we can conceive of past, present, and future simultaneously, particularly under great stress. I've experienced it. I was in a rollover accident on the 405 in California, and I experienced that. I won't go through the details, but it actually happened to me, and I understand what that is. And I think that was an expression of how these neuroendocrine hormones wash over us. And I was a long distance runner for many years, so I experienced the endorphin high. That is a similar kind of thing. But I think it's what creates that unity. So Belushka and this guy Reber, a psychologist, published a book on the unicellular organisms being conscious. So this guy, this German physiologist who studies paramecia, he puts glucose into the water. The paramecium, calcium lights up and paramecium gravitates towards the sugar. That's the same thing that happens if you put glucose on my tongue and I'm in an MRI. Same thing. It's no different. It's the same process. It's just a matter of how any given organism has adapted to its own niche and how they've become successful. We're all survivors. So I think that one of the things that I feel very strongly about is not unlike removing the Earth from the center of the solar system, we must remove ourselves from the center of the biosphere because we have to get over ourselves. We're killing ourselves, we're killing the planet. And I know that sounds like, yeah, of course, we will not argue about that, but there's a reason for that. It's because we are conscious of being conscious, and we know there's an end game. No other organism knows that. That's what's driving us nuts.
As regards verticality and temporal process, I guess it's coextensive with tool making and tool use, because to make and use a tool, you have to associate a process, a problem, stop using the tool, and then the solution. And it's quite interesting that apart from primates, the other animals that are known to use tools are birds to some extent.
Right.
And also understanding speech, but that might just be not understanding speech, but being able to replicate speech. We've got some parrots here, so that just makes me think of that. But could there be some connection to this verticality and this bipedalism to having this sense of time and ability to use tools?
Yeah, so birds like humans can use tools, and birds like humans experience it's in REM sleep that we process epigenetic information that's been collected during the day.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a commonality. And back to your comment, Nicola, about the past, present, future thing. Only humans and other large primates have this area of Broca that houses both motor skills and language. That has to have been an evolved process, which is what I was talking about and going on about the selection pressure. That is the prime example of phenomenon.
But a counterexample is that the other potentially intelligent species is dolphins, and they are not bipedal or vertical. So there's maybe some devil's advocate argument there.
Right.
Well, but a lot of those, aquatic mammals evolved from land-based animals, and somehow, dogs evolved into seals. We know that from the genomics. Hippos evolved into whale. I think it's hippo whale. I don't know that there's any evidence for dolphins, but my point being that they were able to make that transition back to water from land, which was hugely stressful. And it may not be just bipedalism, it's other such events, such as the transition from land back to water that has forced a poising of the system in which you get this integration. So it's no longer vertical, but it's horizontal, but that's semantic. I don't think that it's the stress, it's the universe, it's that huge stressor that allows for the adaptation that I think creates that higher consciousness, if you will, or cognizance of awareness, whatever.
Folks, we've been in here for 2 and a bit hours now.
Yeah.
I think everybody's a bit tired. But I mean, this has been a wonderful session, and despite all the technical, very weird interruptions, it must be the cosmic consciousness somehow interfering with our Zoom. But it doesn't seem to matter, because this stuff is so rich, and I'm just so grateful, John, for you to do this, and for being with us, and not just being with us today, but obviously being with us for all of this, which is fantastic. And it's such a fantastic contribution to the whole discussion to consider physiology and biology in the context of everything that we talk about here. So thank you very much. Look, we're going to meet again tomorrow. Mike McCulloch is going to talk about information loss. And I'm very much, I don't think Mike's here, so he can't give us a preview, but I very much look forward to seeing you all then. Okay, so I shall send 2 videos around this evening. And but thank you, John, once again. It's been wonderful. Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Bye.